still really exciting, really interesting. So we'll talk about continuous integration and version control, definitely leaning on the continuous integration side. So there are sound effects. So just so you guys know, the format of the presentation was it's actually been trying to make it look like a vintage video game. So this sort of vintage game type thing. But I did have a little issue with my MacBook here, so I had to transfer over the presentation to this one here. So Dan's graciously allowed me to use his, and fonts are different. So you won't get as much as the vintage gaming effect as I wanted, but we do have the sounds. So that's good. That's good. All right, so Dan's already given me a pretty good introduction. You guys know a little bit about what I've done, what I do. But I will actually talk a little bit more about my role as a sales engineer. I know that's a little bit different than what most of you guys probably do. I work with customers and try to figure out how to get past their problems and allow them to work seamlessly with the WP Engine platform. It's really interesting. It allows me to be both technical and also have a chance to talk to people and be a communicator, which is it's really interesting role. I've done this after so it's been about 3 years now, and prior to that, I've been a developer, freelancer, working with I'm going to say the D word here, Drupal, for quite a long time. And then prior to that, I mean, I've worked with many content management systems, some proprietary, one called Clickability for some time, and then, of course, WordPress in the very early stages and here and there. And it's just really nice to work with WordPress on the level that I do, which is really exploring, trying to figure out how to do things that customers want. So the reason why I wanted to just talk a little bit about that is because we are hiring a sales engineer in the UK. So I could have shared this in the community update, but I think that just giving you some of the perspective there is really helpful. So we're looking for somebody who's both technical and client-facing to work with customers and really help us out. It's just getting super busy, and it's a really exciting time. Our office is mainly sales and marketing, so it's it may be a different skill set than some of you are interested in having, but if you're strong at communicating and have a technical mind, it could be a really cool possibility. And so the other things that I do when I'm not doing coding, not doing sales engineering, is music technology. So I also produce music, and I've got a studio at home. I've done that for many years, and I've got some music out on SoundCloud at Spice Cadet. So that's the name that I usually go under, and that's also my Twitter handle. Cool. So we're going to talk about deployment, version control, continuous integration. So really working with a deployment tool and versioning your code in order to have a really cool workflow. I'll talk about the main problem, the reason why I wanted to talk about this, and then look at the solution, take a review of the script. I have here, it says demonstration. That's going to be fun. We're going to do it though. I figured out a way to do it, so I think it'll be a little bit less than what I wanted to show, but I'll be able to go into the actual deployment, and you'll see how that runs. And then the takeaway, this is a real project that I actually had to solve for a customer. I'll tell you what I've learned, and I think it's one of the things is that it's an ongoing process. So the problem. So essentially, I've worked with a couple of companies that they're more technical and they want to use Git and they want to use version control. They also don't want to have their plugins in a repository with their code, right? They think of it as a dependency, and it's not really necessary. So the problem is, how do we address that on a platform like WP Engine? And it doesn't have to be. It could be any host that you can use Git for, or even SFTP, as sometimes you can deploy with other different protocols. So it's really about getting that working and also making it easier to work with a group of developers, and that's where the version control comes in, and to some extent the continuous integration. So what I wanted to do is manage the deployment stage and make sure that there's some consistency in the way that code is actually pushed to a server. Get rid of anything that's repetitive. So I don't want to have to do the same thing over and over again. If there's some way to automate that, it's just much easier for developers and less error prone. And I think that's a really important part of the continuous integration. It is actually making it a safer process. Also, once you develop a plan for continuous integration, it makes it safer to use your best practices, right? So you've got that pretty much done. Developers don't really have to think about what happens between here and the website. They push the code and something happens and it goes live. The testing is also very important. That's something that you can build into the deployment pipeline, and you can have multiple processes for different servers. So let's imagine that you want to push to your staging server, and that might be slightly different than what you would do on your production server. So the solution involves a couple of different technologies, and I think the key components here, like I've said, are continuous integration and version control. A couple of other things that I'll go into as well. So the idea for this customer that I worked with is they work locally. I'm sure many of you do. I'm working on several different laptops, several developers. They need a place to keep their code that is not like a place where only one person can work, but a place where everybody can contribute their changes and their code. So keeping the plugins outside of and even WordPress core outside of your repository, because they have repositories. That code exists somewhere else, and we don't really need to maintain it. It just makes it easier to pull in what's needed and worry about the things that you're actually working on. Deploying to testing prior to production allows you to have a safer deployment. So, and I think that automation is really cool, but there is some part of this that has to be manual, where you go through and actually verify that the changes are good and that it's safe for this code to be deployed to production. And then the build and testing process was really important. So there's things that happen with the theme that I'm using, where it's not just code that I need to, that it's not CSS that I can just copy up. There's actually a build process that has to be done with a task runner. So I've sort of thrown out the term continuous integration a couple times already, but it's the benefits are it's when you're not taking a code base and doing a release cycle that's monthly or let's say annually or something like that. So it's not big version numbers and a huge change that gets pushed out. We're talking about changes that happen every single day, not just one person, but a team working together. We need to make sure that everything works and that we don't get to a point where it's 2 months after something has been started and you find out that the code is not compatible and there's 2 developers working on something and it's just not working together. So with this type of integration process, you avoid some pitfalls which come around integration. So it's sometimes called integration hell. And it is just when you realize that things don't work after a really long time spent. So continuous integration is a huge benefit for avoiding things like that. You can detect problems early, and then the testing and verification happens anytime a push goes to Git. So the workflow that I've used is working locally. So all of the actual development is done on a laptop. I use central version control, continuous integration with a build script. It has the dependency management, and then there's actually some configuration that does the push to server. And it's really interesting because it is like, if you break it down into bullet points, quite simple, but will take some time to get through. So I used Git, GitHub in a way that, so I work locally in Git, and I use GitHub so that I can manage things like if I have a pull request or there's a merge, that's a way that I can collaborate and actually talk to other people that are working on the team. And it's actually, I think it's probably pretty common for most of you guys to use GitHub. I know that there's other ways or other different version control systems. But the idea is that we're putting the code in a central place, and we have multiple people that are working on that. And you have the option to actually merge into a master branch or a staging branch, and then from there decide what the actual pipeline is for deployment. So the workflow, what happens is I'll push from my laptop to the repository, and then this whole deployment process happens. And it's so the interesting thing is the deployment tool that I use, which I'll talk about in a bit, is actually watching for changes. So anytime a change happens in my master branch, it knows to start kicking off that deployment process. So there's some configuration there. It does the install and build process, then dependency management, and then it actually does that push. And it's really a customizable script. And what happens then is that gets pushed out directly to my site. So my site has its own Git repository, so I push from locally from Git to GitHub, and then deployment tool, and then it goes back out to Git in WP Engine. So initial setup, what happens in the deployment. So in the tool, there's this setup phase, which consists of cloning the repository, installing any of the applications and the tools that need to happen for deployment to run. Environment configuration, so there's a couple of constants and things that I just tried to make easier, and then the build process as well. Build process itself is almost a sub-process, so I use, it's using Gulp, and essentially it runs a couple of different things like compiling Sass code so that I have CSS files. The idea is that I don't want to commit anything, any code that's not that's compiled, because that can be run at the time of deployment. So it's processed and then actually pushed out. Dependency management. So I've used WPackagist, which is essentially it's a clone of the WordPress repository in a way that Composer can see and interact with it. And that pulls in all of the plugins that I want to use. So instead of keeping plugins in the repository, all there is actually a JSON file. There's a file that lists out the plugins that I want, and it pulls them in. That happens locally, and not in Git, but actually after that code has been pushed in the deployment tool. There's some testing. Admittedly, there's only one circle there. It is a bit light. I think that there's a couple of things that I would want to improve. This is one of them. So automated testing, so that I know that it's going to work and we're not going to push broken code and cause issues. So let's talk about the tools. So I've been really sort of vague about the tools. Let's actually get in. Let's name names. We'll get into it. So I use Sage as a theme, and I think that Sage has some really cool integrations. It's definitely on the forefront of what can be done with the theme, and I really like that it has built in. So if you don't really know too much about Gulp, you don't have to go and start from scratch. It's just a good starting point. So I think it's been really interesting. It is a little bit more technical. I don't know what the best theme to start with is. It will take some time to learn how this works, and I'm actually using the prior version. I think I used version 8. There's a new version 9, which is a little bit more. It's actually a little bit more streamlined, and things change, so it's probably better to start a project with the newest version if you intend to. Local development I do on BBB, and it's been actually really smooth to get that set up. Working with a Vagrant environment in itself can be challenging. There are things that go wrong. It depends on different versions, so VirtualBox and Vagrant, and if there's any Vagrant plugins and things like that. So it can be a hassle, but I think that once it is up and running, it's cool. It's actually a virtual machine that I work on rather than my own computer for local development. So I may look at something like Docker and try to. I think that's probably the next step is a containerized workflow. And I think that probably from the infrastructure level, I think a lot of hosts will be moving to containers if they haven't already. So Gulp and NPM. So essentially, a lot of the build phase is using NPM. So Gulp is essentially a list of commands. It's based around JavaScript, and it's really simple. It's just piping one thing into the next, and that's where I'm doing the majority of that SAS compiling. I really don't use it for more than that, but minification and JSLint are some of the other things that you can do. You can really have a super customized workflow around the task manager. So of course, collaboration, I talked about Git, I've talked about GitHub already, so I did actually reveal what I was talking about, which is okay. So you guys know those are essentially the tools. You don't have to use GitHub. Of course, you can use Bitbucket or anything else that is your preference. Composer is the dependency management system that I use. Actually, one of the cool things I just realized is if you go to the Composer website, Get Composer, this little guy is a different color each time. So if you refresh the page, it'll take you a couple times to get that color. So I thought it was really cool with this crazy green hair, so I put him in there. My CI tool, the mysterious CI tool, is CodeShip, and it's something that I looked at for a while back. And there's not really a reason why I picked this over any other tool. It's just what I happened to look into, and it worked, and I continued to use it. It's been really interesting. What CodeShip does is it actually creates a virtual machine, and it allows you to run a script in that virtual machine. So you essentially spin up this server, run a script, and it does exactly what you asked it to do, and then it pushes out the site. So it's just another step between your GitHub when you push to the repository and then actually getting to your live site. So it's really interesting, and I think there's a lot of possibilities here, and I probably scratched the surface of this, and it can go way deeper. The CodeShip tool is actually something that you could look at. You can see all of the processes happening on their website. There's also a way to get there's a Chrome plugin that will also notify you if a build has happened, if there's an error. And it's pretty intuitive. I'd say it's simple enough where you could see anytime you push to Git, it will list it out. This is what you're looking at is the project. So I've got my site as a single project. And then this will show you each of the commits that have actually happened. So I've deleted a folder from the repository. I've done some compiling. So anytime that I make a change, it's there with the actual commit that's gone into Git. One of the cool things about CodeShip is that if you're actually working and you're trying to do a deployment and you're trying to debug, there's a way to actually spin up that machine or a virtual machine and go step by step through what you're trying to do. And I think this is one of the coolest things. I'd love to show this. I'm not sure if I can. We'll try to demo that because it essentially gives you, it generates a little SSH login, and then you can go into that virtual machine and actually run anything and see how CodeShip has checked out the code. And then from there, you can do anything that you need to before it goes out to Git. There's a tab inside of each project. There's a deploy tab, and this is the guts of CodeShip. So this is what's actually running on the server. This is what I've customized. How many of you can read that? So the good news is I've got this on another slide that's really big, and we'll go line by line through this code. So. All right, cool. So one of the things that was really interesting, and I did see a post about this. Assertable is it allows you to look at any URL or any endpoint and run tests on it. So that's what I'm doing for my testing, and it's really just looking for a 200 status code and no 404 errors. So that's really simple. That's similar to what I know is done for some of the automatic updates on hosting platforms. So it's not really going through and actually doing unit testing. It's just looking at statuses. I think for my site, for the prototype, that's good enough. This could definitely be improved. So when you log into Assertable, again, it's another web tool. You can see that you can set up some tests here. So I've got my 200 OK and then 404 on post. So I'm really just looking at my home page and understanding, does it still work or is it broken? Okay, cool. So let's dive into some code. I think this is actually not going to be too difficult to understand. I'll really just go through it and explain it, what it's doing. We don't have to talk about the lines. The constants, so I've just set some shortcuts, so things that are actually reused throughout the script. And then the idea here is that I can use different versions of this for different scripts. So you can see it says environment production. I can actually use that staging and then just change that and have this run an entirely different process for staging. So the build process starts out then. The first line is using Node. So I use the most current version of Node. So use Node version manager, use stable. I think it's actually not 8.7.0 now. I think that's actually, things change quite quickly. I think it's gone up. Some of the things here are actually done because there are errors. So disable xdebug because it actually throws an error. And very simple, just cut it out and no problem. So CodeShip does a clone process. So I told you it's watching the repository. So each time you push to Git, it knows, yep, there's a change. I'll take that repository, clone it, and start from there. So on this virtual machine, it's already got a clone of the repo. And it keeps it in this directory called clone. So there's a couple of problems with that. But first, I set up the environment and essentially just set some settings for Git. So username, user email, and then I add a remote, which is actually where I'll push out the code to once we're done. And this uses those constants that I set in the beginning. It just replaces what's there with my email, and then environment is production, install is Edmun. So CodeShip does something called a shallow fetch, and essentially it doesn't get every single revision of a file. It stops at something like 50. So I think if you watch the deploy process, you see it does a shallow checkout in the beginning. This is no good. This doesn't work. So I have to I have to essentially do another fetch that's not shallow and get all of the code, and then I can push out without having any errors. So I change it to my theme directory. So go into the Sage directory, and then I run the Composer install. And this is essentially the location where I have this Composer lock file. And the lock file is essentially just a list of anything that I've already installed locally. And that's committed into the repository. That helps to keep in sync with what I'm using locally. So I'll have the same versions there until I change anything on my local environment, and then commit that Composer lock file. So npm runs, this is really just installing stuff. So I do the npm install, Bower install, which I think it does Bootstrap and jQuery. I know that Bower is probably not the best tool to use these days, and it does throw up actually some warnings in the deployment process. The next version of Sage addresses this, uses yarn instead. And then I use this gulp with a production argument. And essentially, there's for the Sage theme, it has two different ways that you can compile, and one is meant to be done locally, which is just gulp, and then gulp production runs a different process, and that's entirely just for production. And that's meant to eliminate any of the the compiled files from the repository. So it actually just generates the code and it doesn't really store anything. So from there, so I've tried to remove anything unnecessary. Admittedly, I don't think this works the way that I intended it to. In fact, I don't think it works at all. But it's something with a little bit of tweaking that I think can work. And the idea here is that I would actually change the git ignore file, have a different git ignore with things that I want to eliminate from my repository. So I think I actually probably have to do to remove the files from the repository and then do the git ignore. That said, it doesn't really matter. This is we're just talking about cleaning up things like JSON files and anything that's not really needed on a production server. So it's just being really meticulous and trying to get rid of anything that's not truly WordPress and truly not a file that's been compiled. So that's pretty much it. Then this last part is where it's actually getting pushed out to Git. And so I add all of the changes. So and you know, for the most part, the build process of Gulp actually writes files, and then Composer writes files. We take those, check them in, and commit to with this CodeShip deployment message. And then I do a push. So I push out to our remote that we set up before. What's interesting here is that the code that I'm pushing is not the same as the repository. So it doesn't match what's in Git at all. So I've completely changed a lot of the files with the build process. And I'll talk about the reason why in a few minutes. The assertable test, it's really just a curl request, and that's just essentially the service and some variables there that runs as the last part. And that just essentially lets me know that it's okay. I think I get an email if the tests fail. Okay. You know, there were a lot more of those. I'm not sure why that was the only one that popped up. Demonstration with a capital N. Don't ask me why. I have no idea. Okay. So I'm just going to, what I'll do is I'm going to pop out of the presentation, but just quickly. So I will have to show you the site that I used. Are you guys seeing that?
No.
I'm going to drag this over.
Straight up.
Has it gone? Oh, there it is. Oh, is it up? Oh, it's up. Yes, that makes sense. All makes sense now. Okay, well, looks a lot different than it should. The key here, so this is my own website. I've just changed the color of the hover for this logo. So it's normally blue. I've changed it to pink. So what I will do right now is just push my changes. So I pushed to my master branch, essentially done the changes. I've run my my task runner, so I've run Gulp, and then it essentially is doing the deployment process now. We've got to be really quick here, so I'm going to go into CodeShip and give it a refresh. Oh, so it's actually running. So this one where you can see change color back to blue, that's exactly what we were looking for. And I can actually click into this and see what it's doing. So I told you it does the shallow clone. It does, you can see git clone branch master depth 50, exporting environment. It's doing a lot of those commands that I've just sort of run through. So nvm, removes xdebug. What's cool is you actually get to see it run through the processes. So it's not just a website, it's its own virtual machine doing everything right now. So right now it's going through and getting all of my plugins. So this is Composer running, and you can actually see the output of that. A little bit of time to run through one of the next steps. So we'll probably just go on with the next section and then come back to it and see how it changes. But the general idea is you're actually getting to see this and run its tasks. Yeah, so I think that a few of these will take some time. So we'll come back to it. Okay, so I learned a lot from doing this. And I think I alluded to this being not a simple process. This was not like an hour or 2 hours of work. This was an ongoing thing, a couple hours every now and again for many months, and just trying to figure it out was difficult. So I think the coolest thing that I realized is that it's not just a website that does some magic in the background. It's literally another server that's been provisioned that runs all of this. And that just blows my mind that this thing pops up, runs, and then disappears and just goes away. But I think that's really interesting. It's such a cool concept that you can just run something, install things, and then just don't need it anymore. There's a lot of things that, as far as deployment goes, there's a lot of options and things that you have installed already, so it's a fully capable virtual machine. You probably don't have to install much because there's a lot there anyways. It caches anything that's NPM, so it will make that deployment process quicker. So one of the things it doesn't do is cache anything that's PHP, so it won't cache the plugins. And I think that's something that they're working on at CodeShip, but I don't know when or if that's actually available. And that debug mode, I think, is one of the coolest things. And I'll see if I can pop that open, because I think that it would be really cool to show you guys what that looks like for a second. Right, so Git integration was really difficult. And just the concept of understanding that what happens, I'm making changes on a server, and how to get them back into my Git repository on the production server. So I just didn't really understand that I needed to actually commit the code back in, and then I'm pushing it to another server. But that's not the same, it's not the same commit. And that doesn't ever, I never store this. So when I push to production, that commit never gets saved in the repository. It's actually just generated based off of the last commit. So that was really interesting to try to wrap my head around. It took a long time, a few different attempts, and I initially started doing this with SFTP, which was, it worked. It was incredibly slow. And this process would take about 20 minutes for deployment, and this does it in under 5 minutes. One of the things, I didn't really call this out when I was going through the code, but there's an option there that many people probably don't use. It's the git push with the force option. And what that does is it doesn't care what's on the server. It just literally overwrites anything. And that's important because this what I've actually pushed doesn't match the repository. It doesn't match the commit anymore. And that's actually not stored in the master. So Git won't allow you to push unless you use force. So force is probably not best practice if you're going to try to keep things like a mirror image. But in this case, it's actually exactly what I want. Lots of things can be run in this build process. So it's not just gulp. You can do grunt, webpack, anything that you can actually script out and run from a server can be done. I mentioned that there was a different process for gulp with production and locally, so that there's a way to actually not commit any of those the files that have been generated, and that's exactly what we want. So even though I run it on my local machine, it's a different process than what runs on production. And then it's possible to have a different build for staging. Let's say you have a different process that you want to see, or on another dev or UAT server. So it can be different for each branch, and then it can be triggered anytime the branch is pushed. So if I push to staging, it might do something else with more testing, let's say. And then the whole idea here is that you're able to use multiple branches and different environments and different servers, and that really allows you for that flexibility where you're able to continue working on, let's say, UAT, where content editors are working. Maybe your development is where your actual code is happening, and then staging is used for testing. So what I will do, as this is an evolving project, is to work with Assertable. I think that's a really cool platform. I'll definitely, as my needs grow, I'll do some more testing there. So I had a good, honest try with removing the files that I said with the git ignore. So that definitely needs to be tweaked. I don't think it's a big thing though, but it would be really cool just to get that done, just for the sake of it. Does anyone think it's scary that there's no rollback? Did anyone think of that? Yeah, it is scary. It is scary. So there is in a way, there's a rollback. You can essentially redeploy, but I think at the professional level, we need to be prepared that things aren't going to go right all the time and have a plan for when it fails. So that's something that I would need to address with this plan for it to be a truly viable commercial solution. And then, I thought it would be so cool to do more with testing, like a visual regression test. I could actually see a page and get a screenshot and look to see what's changed on that page. And then if anything was really bad, if there was a certain percentage of that change that didn't match, then it would be rejected. So I think that's fantastic. There are ways to do that, and I think it's just a little bit more time. So with that, I think we've reached the end. I've got a couple of reference points here. So there's a few articles and things that I used to when I was going through this as reference and just some guidance if you're interested in doing more with CI, version control, and deployment. So this the first one is it's a guide for working with GitHub and in a team environment. Continuous deployment is just essentially a starting point for CI. Optimizing local development is a link so that you can get things set up with BBB. And CodeShip deployment script is actually a version of what you guys saw, what we walked through. And then post-deployment smoke testing is where I got the idea to use assertable. So with that, I'll just jump back to the website, and we'll see how the deployments are. There it is. Amazing. I'm just going to refresh this. And you're going to see some magic. So, logo's gone back. And then I guess just the one other thing that I'll show you really quickly if I can is that, are we good on time? Have a minute or so? All right, so I'll just go into, I'm going to go back a step here. I can get it from here. So you can actually do things. So when I was talking about rollback, it can happen. You can restart this build. You can actually redeploy it. But if your code is broken, right, it's going to do the same thing over again. So if it's truly like just something that didn't work in deployment, then this will work. If you go to debug the build, this is actually generating a server for us to actually test the code on. So it does say 60 seconds. I don't think it's going to take that long for us. So, yeah, this is the part where I should have brought a good list of terrible jokes, but I did not. All right, I think it's going to happen for it. Oh. Yes. Okay. Pop this open in a new terminal. Wow. Okay. I'm going to go, just paste that in. And it's like a slow train, right? Just chugging along. Well,
I just ask, do you have those links to those resources somewhere?
I do. I'll post the presentation on SlideShare, and then I'll tweet it so you've got the links. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so sadly that doesn't look like it's happening. I'm not quite sure why. It should have gotten us in there by now. But I'm happy to answer any questions if you guys are not too confused and disoriented by all this crazy stuff. So.
Yeah, thank you for